Well, that's where the Taliban and Al-Qaeda links then become so deeply entrenched that you can't talk about one without talking about the other. At the moment, they're not completely united. I mean, I see the Taliban as a sort of opposition phenomenon, not as a long-term solution for Afghanistan, but something that exists in a dysfunctional society. And there are ways of moving them out. I used to travel during the Taliban years a lot in Afghanistan with them. I mean, when they were in power. And I remember a mullah in the south I stayed with who said, was a tribal elder who said, well, you know, they're fine young men, really. They're a bit enthusiastic. You know, this idea that they were sort of, you know, like good Boy Scouts, but they just went a little bit too far. But they do have very deep roots in society. I mean, the Taliban didn't create conservative attitudes to women in Afghanistan. They imposed values from villages which existed already on the cities. That was the problem. They came into Kabul and Herat and Mazar, particularly Mazar in the north, which is much more of a sort of Central Asian city where there were women doctors and women walked pretty openly in the streets. It wasn't a Pashtun conservative town. You could watch Indian films right up until the time the Taliban took over the north in 1998. But they did impose this Pashtun village morality. And to describe, you know, the Taliban as something aberrant in Afghanistan is I think is a sort of misunderstanding. I once interviewed I didn't interview her. I wasn't allowed to meet her, but I did a rather bizarre 5-way television interview with an Afghan woman in a very, very conservative village. I happened to have a woman producer, and so she was allowed on the women's side of the house. And I wasn't. My translator wasn't allowed to ask the questions directly. The husband had to ask his wife the questions through the curtain in the house. So I was asking questions. My translator would then put to the husband, and which were then filmed by my woman producer on the other side of the curtain. And I mean, I don't know what we got back, frankly, because I mean, it wasn't the finest ethical standards of journalism. But it was quite an interesting interview. She was a woman who lost 3 sons in the war, one to the Russians, one during the Mujahideen years, and one fighting for the Taliban. And her political understanding of what was going on in the country was pretty limited, frankly. As we were leaving the house, I asked my translator, I said, well, you know, we're going to use this interview. I'd just like to know what her name is. And he looked at, there was a freshly skinned goat hanging from a tree. And he looked at this goat and he said, David, if I ask that man his wife's name, I will end up like that goat. Women do not have a name outside their family in many Afghan villages. You know, that's the situation. And changing that you know, will mean working with something potentially called the Taliban. And I agree with James, absolutely, that we haven't asked them what they want since 2001. We just condemn them on one side. But I'm a mere man. I mean,
I'd agree with that, and certainly Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN negotiator's key regret was not having either the Taliban themselves as a political formation, or at least more representatives from the sort of deep Pashtun tribal areas at the Bonn Agreement, and he feels this is a lacuna, and that this almost forced the Taliban into opposition. I think we've got to be careful about what we mean by the Taliban today. It's very different from the early 90s, what people are observing on the ground. It's been described as a sort of conglomeration between the Taliban, Shura and Quetta, other groups in the northwest frontier. There's now the Taliban, Pakistani Taliban, and then there are groups of essentially common criminals, gangs, people who kidnap, and then they pass on the kidnappees through others for money. So we have to break down what we mean. General Petraeus has been talking about irreconcilables and reconcilables. There's probably a hardcore of ideologues who aren't going to want to have conversation with anybody, but a lot of the foot soldiers are fighting for $2 or $3 or $5 a day because the economy isn't functioning to provide basic livelihoods for people. It's the only way they can put food on the table for their families. Moving forward, what to be done? There's a lot of debate going. Do we negotiate? Do we not? Is it for the Afghan government to negotiate? And one principle is for those who accept the constitution, if the constitution of Afghanistan, again, not perfect, is seen one of the key gains of the last years. There was a big lawyer jirga, a constitutional commission, and Afghans met and they've agreed on the rules of the game for their society. If ex-Taliban will sign up to submit to that basic set of principles, then that could be a good basis for bringing them in. And then moving forward, again, I think one of the things that's terribly welcome about the new Obama policy is that they're putting the diplomatic instruments. They're talking about the full range of instruments of American power, smart power, but by that I think they mean putting diplomacy and negotiation and talking rather than the military instruments out front. And to the extent that the military are being deployed, I think they are, and the hope is they'll be deployed under what's called the COIN doctrine, the counterinsurgency doctrine that was actually invented in Britain but has been reinvented in the US, which means the primary mission is to protect the population. You turn your back on the insurgency, protect the population. There isn't the manpower to do that. And really focus on training up the Afghan National Army, the Afghan police, so that the conflict, to the extent there is a conflict, and I don't think we should be calling it a war. I think maybe it's not a peace effort, but it's an attempt to establish stability, state-to-stabilization effort. That becomes an internal one between Afghans. It's not between the West and Afghans, but it's an internal debate.
It seems to me that one of the real tragedies of Afghanistan, which is a very extendable one, which is that we would have all willed aid. I imagine most people in this room would have willed aid to Afghanistan. That we would have. There would have been a general belief that aid was a good thing, that if they needed schools, if they needed education. And yet we seem to have ended up with a system in which that aid has been spent on the wrong things and the wrong people, and will that change? Do we think Obama understands how appalling that squandering of money improperly has been?
I think he speaks the right language, but I think the American system is so entrenched at doing things in an ineffective way, to use a technical word. The aid is not effective.
You need to explain
what. Well, it goes outside the state. You set up parallel. I mean, Claire knows much more about this in a sense than I do. But some of those stories you told me from the very early years. What about the timber that arrived in Bamiyan?
Shall I go?
Go on.